Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Mimi Ito.
Thanks so much. Okay, many years ago, when my daughter was still pretty small, she was 12 years old, we were spending the summer in Japan, so she was away from her usual routines of school and activities and hanging out with her friends, so she had a lot more time on her hands than she usually did. And I started to notice that she was spending a whole lot of time watching anime series that I didn't think were particularly interesting on YouTube all day. So after a few days of this, I started to get a little bit of that parent concern hat on. And our kids growing up, we didn't really have a lot of time-based rules around media and technology use. If they were doing their schoolwork and after-school activities and sports and spending time with their friends and had a good balance, they were pretty much able to watch and play games as much as they wanted, as long as they got to bed at a reasonable hour. So this was the first time I was like, okay, I'm gonna set some screen time limits for my child. And I can't remember how many hours it was. It was a while ago, but I said, okay, you're only gonna be able to use your computer for this many hours a day. And of course, my daughter was super irritated because I'd never done this before. And then she took action. And so as soon as she woke up in the morning, she would spend her allocated hours watching the things that she thought I would find most unproductive and irritating. And while I'm trying to work from home, she's peppering me with all these ideas of this project she'd love to do, or this question she'd like to investigate online, or this project she'd like to, a creative project she'd like to pursue around coding. Of course, all of these things required a computer. So that was a good lesson for me in some of the dynamics that parents and adults often fall into in trying to take a shortcut to these easy one-size-fits-all top-down solutions, which can often backfire in the trenches of actually negotiating with young people in their everyday lives. And it's doubly ironic because I'm somebody who has spent 30 years endeavoring to study the online world from a youth-centered perspective, meeting young people where they are, respecting their agency and creativity and expertise. So, of course, I am guilty as charged, as my daughter pointed out. So my journey really began, about 30 years ago when I was doing dissertation work with, there's a beautifully wide age range, I think, in terms of the audience. So I hope some people remember those days of multimedia CD-ROMs like Carmen Sandiego and Math Blaster. And so that was the era that I was doing my dissertation work. And then I did some work in Japan around the birth of the mobile internet when Japanese teens were leading the charge for text messaging and camera phones and things like that. And then we, with a large group of colleagues, did a study of that first wave of sort of social media network game adoption in the US about 20 years ago. And then more recently, we're looking at things like what's happening with AI and the current debates about technology and well-being. So in the time we have together, I want to start with a little bit of the broader context that, if you all are reading the news and following research in this area around teens and technology and well-being, which has been getting more and more attention these days, and then talk a little bit about the scientific consensus around what's actually happening there. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's more in my wheelhouse in terms of the research that I've been engaged in myself as a cultural anthropologist, which is around some of how these debates are part of these broader social and cultural narratives and commitments that we have, and how our work in a more social and cultural vein might be able to inform those debates. And then I'll end with a few suggestions and recommendations. But first, I'd love to get a little bit of a vibe check in the room. So I know we have young people in the audience too. So I'll phrase this in ways that work I'll have to think of an intergenerational frame for this. So how many of you have struggled, if you're not a teen, with a teen, or if you're a teen with a parent or a teacher or caregiver over technology use? Okay, most of the room, but not everybody. That's interesting. And then I'd love to get a sense, using your thumbs, like how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the influence of technology on young people growing up today, where, you know, it's been like everything better, faster, good, it's been pretty negative, or it's a mix of both? Okay, I see a lot of sideways. I think almost everybody, I see a few thumbs up. I don't see a lot of thumbs down, so I may be preaching to the choir, but we'll see if I bring something new to the table in terms of people's feelings on this topic. Okay, so let's start with some of the broader debate. I think most of you have probably seen headlines like this, which is about how technology is impacting teen mental health, and maybe the broader context that we are seeing growing rates of mental health problems within young people, and that has among teens. We've seen these concerns that it's tied to technology use. This was really kind of accelerated by advisory by the Surgeon General that the Surgeon General put out in 2023 that got taken up in the media in this kind of way that, you know, there's a warning that social media is harming children and adolescents, and then it's a defining challenge of our time. So there was sort of this kind of heightened concern that we've seen in the past few years, and that has increasingly led to these calls to ban cell phones, to limit social media use, a move towards you know, limitation and prohibition and abstinence. And the piece that's been getting a lot of momentum in this country is cell phone bans in schools, not just by teachers, you know, asking kids to not use their cell phones in class, but at the school district. And the new thing is these statewide bans that have been receiving bipartisan support. And probably the most dramatic example is Australia deciding that they're going to ban social media for all social media for teens under the age of 16. That was approved last year, and they're going to be struggling to implement that this year. So what does the science actually say? And because I'm in a space of National Academy fans, let's start with the National Academy's consensus report that was put out a little bit after the Surgeon General advisory, which really, this is like very consensus report type language, but there's good and bad. And contrary to the current cultural narrative of universal harm, it's actually more complicated. And if you actually look at the advisory, the takeaways, the high-level takeaways in the summary are that, okay, social media use is nearly universal. It presents risks, but it also provides benefits. And the conclusion is kind of a big, we don't know. So that's where the science is. I know that's a little bit of an abbreviated summary, but there's a lot more we can say, and a lot of people have been doing work running the numbers around this, and the conclusion is really that there hasn't been a measurable independent effect of social media at the population level in terms of harms. Okay, so let's do a vibe check of what you all have at the back of your mind, and resist the temptation to Google for the answer. So what is your best guess, I'll give you just a minute, of what percentage of 13 to 17-year-olds in the US, this was a study done last year, say they use YouTube or TikTok almost constantly? Okay. Okay, I hear a lot of like 70s, 80s, 90s. Okay. Now this is self-reported, so take it with a grain of salt, but the interesting thing about this number, and the research is kind of, you know, it bounces around on this issue of like how many young people actually have a problem with overuse, or what is colloquially colloquially known as addiction. And the numbers are pretty usually around this number, that it's not insignificant number, whether it's gaming or social media, who in the scientific literature, we talk about self-regulation, who struggle with self-regulation around media. But it also means that the vast majority of young people do not have a problem with or at least not at clinical levels, do not have a problem with self-regulation or what we might call addiction. So I think it's an important caveat to realize that the struggles are real for a subpopulation, but it's not for all young people. Now, when young people themselves are asked whether they think it's good or bad, and it's pretty much that sideways that we saw in the room, that there's a lot more young people who will say that it's positive, and when we do interviews, qualitative work, almost invariably we'll say that it's a lifeline to social connection in this day and date, and a small number who will say it's mostly negative, despite the fact that young people, like all of us, are being barraged with all of this negative press about technology. So this leads me to dig into this a little bit more from a cultural and social perspective. So why is there this disconnect between what the science is showing and what we believe to be true about the impact of these technologies? And this is where it's kind of a cultural analysis of these patterns or mindsets or beliefs that we have that are quite powerful. And I think in this day and age, not to go too meta, but with social media and other technologies, it has a tendency to reinforce our narratives, right? So we tend to get fed a bunch of stuff that we believe already. And so the question of polarization of beliefs and narratives is actually even more salient in our current media environment. But this way of looking at and analyzing patterns for the kind of belief systems is part of our toolkit as cultural anthropologists. And there's two that I want to talk about today. The first is this belief that young people are victims and are being harmed by technology, and that adults carry the solution. I call it the adult savior complex. And then the other is that technology is like this thing out there that is just like impacting society and culture like a cannonball, and whether you believe it's good or bad, it's just this thing that's like out there doing things. So that's what we call technology determinism. So those are two narratives that are very well established in the culture. So let's start with this first one. In addition to the kinds of headlines that I've showed you already, in the 20 years or so that I've been doing this research in this country, there's been, with every new wave of technology, there's been commentary and punditry that is really about how there's a crisis that's being brought on by this technology. It's something that adults have to take control of, and it's impacting like all kids. It's like a generational issue. It's a population level issue. It's not 16% of kids, it's all kids. That's the kind of vibe that we're getting from a lot of this. And it's pretty scary, honestly, because there's some truth to it. Like, there are some young people who are really struggling, but there's also some nuance that's being missed by some of this, and some interpretation of the data that might differ from what the scientific consensus is these days. So as a cultural anthropologist, we do the work of hanging out with kids, specific kids, and the activities that they're engaged in everyday life. And I'm always very self-conscious about talking about this when there's a group of young people in the audience. But this is work from a while ago, so maybe it has the benefit of history of being a little bit less familiar. So if you remember in the days when One Direction was popular, okay, that'll bring you back, that'll place you in time and space. One of our she was a graduate student at the time, Ksenia Koropkovka, did a study of One Direction fans who use the platform Wattpad, which is a mobile, the first major mobile fan fiction publishing platform, and studied kind of the learning and creative stuff that mostly girls, but not only girls, were doing on that site. And just to share a little bit of the voices of young people from that study, we found that there was this real sense, even though One Direction was a huge fandom, in fact, maybe the majority of like tweens, girls at the time were into it, there was this sense that, when we talk to educators too, even educators and parents kind of don't like games and that boys play, but there's like a real kind of eye roll phenomenon when it comes to young girls fandom. So it wasn't like this interest that young people girls wanted to display outside of their, immediate peer group. And the ability to connect online with other One Direction fans was just a huge phenomenon at the time, and creating, narratives and artwork around it. And it was really interesting and a persistent finding across different kinds of interest groups that often these online communities and connections are most valuable for kids who might struggle to find friends with shared interests in their local communities. So this quote is a really nice example of a young person who said that she found her my first ever true friend in the One Direction fandom. And also the mixed age pieces are a really unique aspect of these online affinity groups. And then the other dimension, which we found was really interesting from this case, is that, fan fiction readers, they read like hundreds of pages of fan fiction, a week, a month, or whatever. They're often writing, but when they're interviewed about and say, oh, so you're a reader, it's like, no, I'm not a reader. Oh, you're a writer. No, I'm not a writer. Those are things we do in class. So there was sort of this disconnect between, what young people were doing in these interest-driven spaces and what they were doing in school. And, there was this sense that, even for like the writing teacher, that this wasn't shared with the adults in their lives, that they were active in these fan communities. And there's sort of this intergenerational disconnect, is particularly with interests that are stigmatized. So we saw this with gaming, we saw this with One Direction, we saw this with WWE. There is a different dynamic with interests that are more celebrated among adults in the local community, but this intergenerational disconnect was a really persistent one. And then a lot of the work that we've done over the years around gaming, we have a similar dynamic where there's these online spaces, whether it's social media or creative communities like Wattpad, or gaming communities, most recently, Roblox and Minecraft. These are all tools that have radically expanded young people's ability to connect, to communicate, to create, to mobilize. And that's really the arc that has been changing over the past 2 or 3 decades, that has really been accelerating the challenge that as adults we're facing when these very connected young people walk into spaces like this with their mobile phones and their laptops, and suddenly the ways in which that we have usually insisted on compliance and listening and control have suddenly changed, because it's hard to remember that before the advent of the mobile phone, it was really hard for teenagers to have private conversations with each other. Like, these simple things have changed so dramatically in the power dynamics between adults and children and young people. And we used to believe that children could only manage very simple narratives of good guys and bad guys, and then suddenly Pokemon comes along and there's 300 monsters, each with their different specialties, and they power up and they combine and morph in different ways. And suddenly we realize that 9-year-olds can master these incredibly complex universes and traffic and value and tokens. And the world of childhood has changed, dramatically in terms of agency. So sometimes, kids do things that are kind of cool, like create, fan fiction. And sometimes they do things that we're not as happy with as adults, like, ratemyprofessors.com was one of the first things that happened when the internet became widespread on college campuses. Cheat House, this has been around well before ChatGPT, where you can download, ready-made essays, and now, of course, it's all AI-powered, or, services where you can just have people take your online class for you. So suddenly there's all of these capabilities and free-flowing information that can't be controlled and managed in the ways that we historically limited things like cheating and information flow. So these things we might not be as happy with as adults, but the other thing that's happening is that young people are taking these tools to do really amazing things with newfound digital superpowers. And I remember back after Parkland and while March for Our Lives was being organized that people were kind of surprised at how savvy these young people were on social media and mobilizing. And, I was like, where have you been? This is what young people do every day. You have to manage publicity and reputation and public discourse from a very young age because you're on whatever the platform of the day is. And suddenly these capabilities that we or these social participation modes of publicity that we used to protect kids from until they were closer to adulthood, young people are being exposed to and having to navigate at a very early age. And when they're thrust into the public eye, like the Parkland students were, it's oh, they actually know how to do this. And now I think it's a little bit more commonplace that people understand young people's agency and voice, with climate activism and other things. But at the time when Parkland happened, it was a genuine surprise to society that these young people were so articulate and had such strong leadership skills. So the counter-narrative then to this victim adult savior narrative is that a lot of these tensions are not necessarily because kids don't know what to do with technology or are disempowered, but actually because they are more and more empowered. And we have to, as a society and as grown-ups who manage grown-up institutions, have to adapt to recognize the increased empowered and sort of tech-savvy nature of young people, and also to recognize the diversity of young people's experiences. So it's not like all kids are March for Our Lives activists any more than all kids are addicted to TikTok. So recognizing that diversity of experiences is incredibly important. Okay, so I'm going to take another pause for a data point. So what's your best guess of what percentage of kids aged 10 to 19 in the US are living in poverty or low income? 30? 27? Bingo. And actually, this is a 2020 number, so I would hazard a guess that the numbers are worse right now. But this number was in the context of a report by Common Sense Media in 2020, looking at this question of young people and mental health and technology, but really trying to understand the broader social context in which this mental health crisis was happening. And Candace Odgers, who's a professor here at UC Irvine as well, and has been, she's really an expert on teen mental health and has been studying it for a long time, and has kind of been dragged into these debates about teen and technology because everybody wants to know the influence of technology. But she's really been studying all of the factors that influence teen mental health for quite some time. And she was one of the authors of that Common Sense report. And in the broader context of what matters, social media is one of the least influential factors, and the things that we already know influence mental health, like poverty, family history, adversity, discrimination, all of these things are what is influencing the mental health crisis. And the report goes on to kind of give us a timeline of the kinds of things that today's teens and tweens have had to live through. This was happening right in the midst of all of the COVID epidemic. And it's just an important reminder that this attention to these things that feel new and scary like technology, they do have an important influence in amplifying and influencing, but they can really draw attention away from some of these bigger contexts. And when we talk to young people, if a young person is stressed or having a hard time, their solution is not take away my phone usually, It's usually like, oh, school is stressing me out, or my parents are stressing me out, or whatever. So again, just to center in some of the realities of young people's lives. And so when we go back to some of those headlines I introduced earlier, you'll notice if you look at how this narrative is described, like social media may harm children and adolescents. Social media is devastating teens' mental health. The agent, the independent variable is the technology, right? Impacting young people or society and culture. And that's what we call in science and technology studies a technologically determinist narrative. And that narrative really importantly applies to both the people who think technology is bad and the people who think it's good. Because tech solutionists believe, like, if you throw a new artificial intelligence tutoring system into school, it's going to solve all the problems. It's like the solution sits with the technology, just like the people who are scared of the new technology's influence believes that the technology is source of all the problems, and it leads to this kind of magical thinking that if you take cell phones out of school, suddenly bullying will go away, depression will go away, everybody's going to be academically focused if you take away the phones and you don't address all of the underlying things. Now, of course, educators are not that simple-minded, but a lot of how it gets applied within policy at a high level reflects this kind of sort of formula of where the solution sits. So I think it's rather obvious, but that technology has changed things, but it's also obvious that technology is people. It's not separable from people and culture and society. And when you see a young person staring at a phone, they're not attached to the phone, they're attached to the thing that's happening on the phone, whether it's content or the people they're communicating with. And so when we did our study, when the earlier wave of concern over teens and technology, we were very careful to not title our work MySpace, LiveJournal, Instant Messaging. We called it hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. It's like, what are the activities that are happening that young people, that all of us have always done, that are being influenced or intersecting with technologies in new ways? And that's, I think, the frame that is the antidote to the technology obsession frame, even while we recognize that, of course, hanging out looks different if you're doing it in Minecraft than if you're doing it in the playground at school. Of course, there are differences, but the underlying drivers of wanting to connect, to play together, to create, to have a voice, to be popular, to flirt with your, romantic interests, all of these things are the same motivations. They're just being channeled through technology and platforms in new ways. So, before I head to my recommendations, I wanted to share just some examples of what it looks like to do these things, these activities that are important to young people, or not just young people, to all of us, connecting, creating, supporting each other, playing in ways that are actually building intergenerational connection rather than division. And, again, it's just this point that we, people, are doing this. It's not up to us to wait around for some feature to be turned off on Facebook or something like that. So here are some, I'm drawing from examples in sort of our community around connected learning, and we had an initiative that was supported by Pivotal Ventures, who's been doing a lot of work in youth and mental health and technology, called the Connected Wellbeing Initiative, where we got to connect with a lot of innovators who are elevating youth agency and voice in this space. So Give Us the Floor is an example of a really great group that has been creating spaces for LGBTQIA young people to connect online and just have affinity groups that are supported by adults who have expertise in well-being and mental health, but really are driven by young people and creating safe spaces for them. So this ability for young people to find kindred spirits and supportive spaces, particularly for young people who do not have those identity-affirming spaces in their everyday communities. Ever since the early days of the internet, this is why queer kids were some of the first groups to mobilize in online communities, has been an essential feature, and why the banning of access to social media spaces are so damaging to some of the most vulnerable young people. Another example of subgroups who have shouldered a lot of the burdens of hate and harassment online, but also derive a lot of the benefits is an example from my colleague Tiara Tanksley, who has studied Black Lives Matter activists and their use of social media, and has really chronicled like the incredible trauma and toll that Black youth experience from seeing images of Black death and dying online constantly in their social media feeds, but is also really careful to stress what she calls spaces of refuge for young people to connect in affinity groups and supportive communities online. So there's both of these dimensions are incredibly important for minority groups. And then already mentioned, Connected Camps is a project that I've been engaged in for many years with my colleague Katie Salen, who's a game designer. And we run online programs in Minecraft and Roblox, but importantly, the educators and mentors in those spaces are all college kids who are Minecraft nerds and game enthusiasts themselves, who we support and train and pay to work with the littles, age 8 to 13, to be fellow enthusiasts, but also that to scaffold and support that really important transition period that a lot of young people don't get when they're making their first forays online. And this, again, another one of my soapboxes, this is why that age-based gate is so problematic, because do we expect that, okay, from 8 to 13, kids want to be online and playing games with each other and on social media, and we ban them from it, and at the age of 14, they're magically gonna be able to figure everything out and just be really good digital citizenships. So what we do is we create safe spaces, kind of like the playground at school, where there is the playground monitor. So when an 8-year-old goes on, starts fixing everybody else's Minecraft builds because they think something is wrong with that wall, somebody explains to them that that's actually griefing and you shouldn't destroy other people's builds. And those are just lessons that, just like in the real world, we need an intergenerational or a mixed stage space in order to scaffold. And then there's an example of a community that's been around for a very long time, over 20 years, Scratch, where they not only provide tools for young people to be able to create and code, but also a community that's moderated, intergenerational. And sadly, there's very few examples of these, of spaces that are open and kid-friendly, especially for that 8 to 13-year-old range, that are intergenerational in nature. So Connected Camps, Scratch, Roblox, I know is controversial for some people, but they are one of the few spaces that has really invested in creating a family-friendly, kid-friendly, social, kid agency-focused online space. And then a last example from more in the media space, but This Teenage Life was one of the innovator groups in our Connected Wellbeing Initiative, but it's an example of a podcast that Molly Josephs, who's a high school teacher, started with her students, but it's expanded into a community of thousands of young people just producing a podcast and talking about, the struggles and the joys of being a teen, and again, using technology and media in a way that is both healthy and affirming and also intergenerational in nature. So these are just some examples of how we can reframe this narrative that technology is something out there that we just have to kind of brace for impact, to saying these are the kinds of things that innovators, educators, people in their everyday lives, young people every day are doing to actually shape and make the technology work for us, and be healthy, productive, inclusive, and so on. So I'll conclude with just a few very high-level sort of suggestions and recommendations. And these might seem fairly simplistic, but I think they're guiding principles that result from really incorporating some of these counter-narratives. So for those of you who are developing technology, who are researchers, policymakers, kind of in that zone, the simplest thing, and the thing that is honestly so rarely done, is to involve young people as experts and leaders, particularly in projects, designs, and policies that involve them. And to recognize their diversity. So don't pick one young person, bring them into a meeting and expect them to speak for all young people. Really understand the specificities of who you're designing for, and think of young people as equal partners, just with particular points of view and lived experiences, just like you would another adult in the room. So something like cell phone bans, I don't think they're universally bad. I mean, there's certainly moments when you don't want, there's whether you're having dinner together or in a class, of course there's moments when you don't want everybody in the room to not be paying attention or have a shared experience. But again, it's rather than, state legislators saying that every school, cell phones have to be checked at the door at every school, what's the process for involving young people, the educators who work with them every day in that decision making? And a big one is the solutions need to be driven by the content and the activities being done rather than the device and platform. So this idea that we're going to ban Facebook and TikTok, oh wait, but YouTube has educational content, so actually maybe YouTube isn't social media, we're just going to define it as not social media, which is what's happening in Australia. And once you start drawing these divisions based on a platform, or let's ban the cell phone, oh, but we're going to FaceTime with grandparents. Oh, or what about if mom needs to get in touch with me during a disaster or to pick me up? And suddenly you're not regulating the thing you want to regulate. Now, I know it's difficult. It's hard to say, okay, we're going to regulate certain uses or promote certain uses, but that's actually what needs to be done. And so to do shortcuts that are, sort of fixating on these categories that don't really map onto people's actual behavior is actually causing a lot of harm. And there isn't a shortcut to making technology work better for us. And then this is kind of a selfish thing, but I feel like the quants get a lot of the airtime in a lot of these debates. And I love my, health researchers and my quantitative social science friends, but I do think there's a role for qualitative work and designers and people who are working deeply with particular subgroups of young people and adults. And that mixed methods approach, I really would wish it would have a bigger influence within policy and technology design. And then, again, just underline that it's, I think what's challenging is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but the wonderful thing is that we are all part of the solution. We don't have to wait for the technology developers and experts to fix everything for us. So I'll return to my story with my daughter because I kind of left that hanging. It actually ended reasonably well. We were irritated with each other for several days, but then we found this tool called Rescue Time, which I think she might still use, that actually just gives her information about what she's doing on her computer. And we just made a commitment that we would review that together. And I stopped with all the time-based rules, and she still struggles. I still struggle with distraction and, maybe watching nowadays TikTok too much. But now she's a software engineer working for a health tech startup, often sleep deprived, but doing pretty well. So I think at the end of the day, it ended up, and we have a good relationship. So all of the big boxes were checked, even though we've definitely had our moments of struggle. So again, it's like at a high level, prioritize connection and communication over control. You will lose the battle over control because technology is creating a dynamic that's making that harder and harder. Have fun together, watch things together, problem solve and create together. I understand that's not always possible, but it's always great when you can. And maybe the easier things is like you are the role model, we are the role models for each other. So social connection, intentionality, and mindfulness, the demands on us to manage attention and be mindful are so much greater for all of us. And we have to build that competency and model that competency. It's not something that you can just top-down require. So it's on us to figure that out. If with great power comes great responsibility, and that's really the mindfulness piece. And then maybe, the easiest in theory, but often quite difficult, is to listen without judgment. You might hate the games or the anime or media or whatever it is that kids are engaged in today, but is that really because technology is harming them, or is it our own judgment and taste because it's stuff that we didn't grow up with? So it's actually really fun and interesting, and to hear what young people are into these days. I feel like I've really benefited. I'm sad now because my kids are now out of the house and aren't teenagers anymore, because I used to, when somebody asked me for my expert advice, I could always just ask my teenagers when they were home. So I'm struggling right now with my own identity crisis and my expert panel, but it's actually really fun to talk to kids about what they're doing online and learning, and they still do tech support for me, so I guess there is that. So thank you so much. That's all I've got, and I'd be happy to chat a little bit if we have time.